I knew he was going to be trouble the moment he called my encryption system cute. Yeah, well, cute is what kept the entire company's financial platform from collapsing. But he didn't just steal my job. He tried to relaunch the entire platform I built, without knowing I still owned all the code. And when the system started falling apart line by line, I just sat there, smiling, with the original contract in hand. My name is Jessica Lane. I'm a 34-year-old software engineer living in Boulder, Colorado. Though this story began when I was still in Austin. For 7 years, I'd been the backbone of Nexora, a digital finance company that had grown from a scrappy startup to a legitimate contender in the fintech space. I wasn't the founder, but I might as well have been. My code ran everything from our security protocols to the intricate back-end systems that processed millions of transactions daily. That's why it felt like a knife to the heart when Marcus, our CEO, introduced Elliot Vance as our new CTO during the Monday all-hands meeting. Elliot comes to us from Vertigo Tech, Marcus announced with that plastic smile he reserved for investor calls. He'll be helping us restructure our engineering department to scale for our Series C funding round. Restructure. The corporate euphemism that sends chills down every veteran employee's spine. Elliot stood next to Marcus, all 6 foot something of him in a button-down that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He had that Silicon Valley look, casual but expensive, like he'd just stepped out of a TechCrunch profile piece. His smile didn't reach his eyes when he shook my hand after the meeting. "So, you're the legendary Jessica," he said, his gaze already moving past me to scan the room. "Marcus tells me you've built most of what keeps the lights on around here." "I've been here since we were 10 people in a co-working space," I replied, trying to sound collegial rather than defensive. He nodded absently. "I'd love to see your documentation. I'm particularly interested in the encryption protocols you've implemented." I'd spent years refining those protocols. They weren't just code, they were my professional legacy, crafted through countless late nights and early mornings. "Sure," I said. "I can walk you through everything tomorrow morning." "Great, let's make it 9 a.m. I have a lot to catch up on." The next morning, I prepared a comprehensive overview of our systems. I created diagrams, compiled code samples, and even prepared a presentation on the philosophy behind our architecture. This wasn't just about impressing the new boss, it was about defending what I'd built. Elliot arrived 15 minutes late, coffee in hand, and barely glanced at my presentation as I walked him through the intricate security measures I'd implemented. "This is all very thorough," he said when I finished, in a tone that suggested thorough wasn't a compliment. "But it's a bit, how should I put this, classically cute." Cute. The word hit like an insult. Don't get me wrong, it's solid work for a startup that was bootstrapping, but we're not that company anymore. We need enterprise-grade solutions, something that can scale exponentially. This system processed over $200 million in transactions last quarter without a single security breach, I countered, feeling heat rise to my face. Elliot swiped through my presentation on his tablet, barely making eye contact. "And that's impressive. But to get where Marcus wants us to go, we need to sunset this entire architecture. Start fresh." Sunset, another corporate euphemism. This one meaning throw away years of someone else's work. "I've been gradually modernizing components as we've grown." I explained, "We don't need to scrap everything. That would introduce unnecessary risk." He finally looked up from his tablet. "Jessica, I appreciate your attachment to your work. That's admirable. But Nexora isn't a hobby project anymore. We need to professionalize." The subtext was clear. My work wasn't professional enough. Me, with my computer science degree from MIT and 7 years of shipping reliable code that kept this company alive. "I'll email you my thoughts on a transition plan," he said, standing up. "Thanks for the overview." That meeting was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Elliot began systematically pushing me to the margins of the company I'd helped build. First came the strategy sessions with the engineering team, scheduled while I was in standing meetings with our product managers. When I asked about them afterward, I got vague responses about aligning on the vision and mapping the future architecture. The future, it seemed, didn't include me. Then Elliot created a new Slack channel called the Next Gen Platform. Everyone on the engineering team was added, except me. I only discovered it when Raj, one of our junior devs, accidentally referenced it in the main engineering channel. Sorry, Jessica, I thought you were in that channel too. Raj messaged me privately afterward. The apology in his text was palpable. No worries, I typed back, fingers stiff with the effort of appearing casual. What's it about? Elliot's new architecture planning. I thought you were leading it with him. I wasn't, and that became increasingly clear as days turned into weeks. In meetings, Elliot began referring to me as our legacy system guardian, or sometimes the heritage preservation lady, as if I were a museum curator rather than a senior engineer. The junior devs would laugh awkwardly while I sat there, professional smile frozen in place. But the real kicker came when I discovered that Elliot had begun renaming my API endpoints and functions, systematically erasing my fingerprints from the codebase. Where I had clear, descriptive naming conventions like validate user credentials, he was implementing vague corporate speak like authentication processing service. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Each day brought a new slight, a new way of pushing me toward irrelevance. I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake replaying conversations, wondering if I was being paranoid or if this was really happening. One night, unable to sleep again, I found myself digging through old papers in my home office. I was looking for something tangible from the early days, something to remind myself that I hadn't imagined my contribution to Nixora. That's when I found it. My original employment contract, tucked away in a manila folder labeled Startup Days. I'd signed it when Nixora was still called FinSecure, operating out of a crowded co-working space in Austin. Back then, the company was too broke to afford proper legal counsel. So my then-husband, a tech lawyer, had reviewed the contract for me. He'd insisted on adding several clauses to protect me, clauses I'd completely forgotten about as the years passed and the company grew. Flipping to Section 15, I found it, Clause 15.3, in plain legal language. In the event that employee is terminated without cause and without 90 days written notice, all intellectual property created solely by employee during their tenure shall remain the property of employee, with the company retaining only a non-exclusive license to use said intellectual property subject to mutually agreed terms. I read it 3 times, heart pounding. My ex-husband had insisted on this clause because FinSecure had seemed so unstable at the time. If they go under or screw you over, he'd said, at least you won't lose your work. I'd never imagined it would become relevant, but as I sat there in my pajamas at 2 a.m., contract in hand, I realized it might be my only protection against what was coming. Because something was definitely coming. I could feel it. The following Monday, I came to work with renewed purpose. If Elliot was pushing me out, I needed to be prepared. I began documenting everything, every code contribution, every system I'd architected, every piece of intellectual property I could rightfully claim under Clause 15.3. I reached out to my ex-husband, now a partner at his law firm. David, I need your eyes on something, I said when he picked up. Jessica, it's been a while. His voice was cautious. Our divorce had been amicable, but distant. I know, and I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but I think I'm about to be pushed out of Nexora. And I remembered that clause you added to my original contract. The IP retention clause, that was ages ago. Yes, but I never signed a new contract, even through all the funding rounds and title changes. Do you think it's still valid? There was a pause, and I could almost see him shifting into lawyer mode. Send me everything you have, the original contract, any amendments, promotion documentation, everything. I did, and 2 days later, he called back. It's solid, he said, and I felt a rush of relief. The company's been sloppy. They should have had you sign new agreements with each major funding round or title change, but they didn't. As far as I can tell, you're still operating under the original agreement, with only salary and benefit adjustments documented separately. So if they fire me without proper notice, then you own the code you wrote, Not all of it. Anything that was collaborative would be more complicated. But systems you built independently? Yes, those would legally be yours. I thanked him, promised to pay his consultation fee, and hung up. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control returning. I didn't have to wait long for Elliot to make his move. That Friday, at 4:30 p.m., the classic firing time chosen to minimize workplace disruption, I received a Zoom invitation from Elliot for 4:45 p.m. The subject line simply read, "Quick chat." I knew what was coming, and my hands were steady as I accepted the invitation. 15 minutes to prepare for the end of a 7-year chapter of my life. I quickly backed up key documentation to my personal drive. Nothing proprietary, just evidence of my contributions. I texted David, "It's happening now." At 4:45 sharp, I joined the Zoom call. Elliot's face filled my screen, his expression a practiced blend of solemnity and detachment. No HR representative was present, another procedural corner cut. "Jessica, thank you for joining on short notice," he began, as if this were just another meeting. "I'll get right to it. As we've been discussing our new direction, it's become clear that your role doesn't align with where we're headed. We've made the difficult decision to part ways." Despite expecting it, the words still stung. 7 years, countless all-nighters, debugging sessions that stretched into dawn, all dismissed in a single sanitized sentence. "I see," I said, keeping my voice even. "And the timeline for this transition?" Elliot looked momentarily confused, as if he hadn't expected questions. "Effective immediately. It has already been notified to revoke your access. You'll receive an email about returning company property and final paycheck details. No notice period, no transition plan for the systems I alone fully understood. Just an immediate severing." "I understand," I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "And will this be documented in writing?" "You'll receive the standard termination email." He glanced at something off-screen. "We're prepared to offer 2 weeks severance, which is generous considering the company's current financial considerations. 2 weeks, after 7 years. I'll need all termination details in writing, including the official reason for termination," I said. Elliot's expression hardened slightly. "As I said, you'll receive the standard email. This is an at-will employment state. Jessica, we don't need to provide a reason." "I understand that. I'd still like it in writing." He sighed. "Your final paperwork will be emailed within the hour. Is there anything else?" "No, that covers it. Thank you for the opportunity to work at Nexora." The corporate platitude tasted bitter in my mouth. "All the best with your future endeavors," he replied, and ended the call. Seconds later, my Slack notifications stopped coming through. My email showed an authentication error. Just like that, I was erased from the company I helped build. My phone buzzed with a text from Raj. "What happened? Your Slack account just went dark." I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I opened my personal email and found David's contact information again. I forwarded him the calendar invitation for the termination meeting with a simple message. "It's done. No notice period. Effective immediately." His response came within minutes. "Document everything. Don't sign anything yet. Call me in the morning." I was just closing my laptop when the promised termination email arrived on my personal address. It was as vague and bloodless as expected, citing only company restructuring and strategic realignment as reasons for my termination. No mention of performance issues. They weren't that stupid. The email outlined the return process for my company laptop and the processing of my final paycheck, plus the 2 weeks of severance Elliot had mentioned. What it didn't include was any mention of the 90-day notice period required by my contract for termination without cause. I forwarded this email to David as well, then finally responded to Raj. "Corporate restructuring. You know how it goes. Take care of yourself." He sent back a shocked emoji and a promise to grab drinks soon. I appreciated the gesture, but I knew how these things worked. Former colleagues quickly became just that, former. I closed my laptop and sat in the silence of my apartment. 7 years, ended in a 15-minute Zoom call. Part of me wanted to scream or cry, but a stronger part, the part that had survived endless coding challenges, technical interviews, and male-dominated tech spaces, was already calculating my next move. Because Elliott Vance and Nexora had just made a critical error, they'd fired me without proper notice, triggering Clause 15.3. The code was mine now. The next morning, Saturday, I met David at his office downtown. The building was nearly empty, giving our meeting an appropriately clandestine feel. "I've reviewed everything," he said as I sat across from him. "The original contract, the termination documentation, or lack thereof, and your contributions to Nexora's codebase." He slid a document across the desk to me. "This is a formal notice asserting your intellectual property rights under Clause 15.3. We'll send it to Nexora's legal team on Monday morning." I skimmed the document. It was comprehensive, listing specific systems I had developed independently: the encryption protocols, the transaction processing engine, the back-end security architecture, the core components that kept Nexora functioning. "What happens after we send this?" I asked. "Best case scenario, they realize their mistake and negotiate a proper licensing agreement with you. Worst case, they dispute your claim, and we end up in litigation." He leaned back in his chair. "But given the clarity of your contract and the documented evidence of your contributions, I like our chances in court." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, they're using your intellectual property without authorization. Every day they continue to do so increases their liability." I nodded, taking this in. "I want to be clear. I'm not looking to destroy the company. There are good people who still work there." "Understood. But you deserve proper compensation for your work. Jessica, what they've done is both legally questionable and ethically reprehensible." I signed the document, feeling the weight of what I was initiating. David promised to file first thing Monday morning and keep me updated. As I left his office, my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Elliott Vance had posted an update. Excited to announce Nexora's technological rebirth, shedding legacy systems and embracing cutting-edge architecture, accelerating into the future. Attached was a promotional image for Nexora 2.0, scheduled to launch in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to rebuild what had taken me years to perfect? I almost laughed at the absurdity. Elliott was either delusional or desperate to prove his value to the board. Either way, he was about to learn a costly lesson about the dangers of underestimating the heritage preservation lady. On Monday, David sent the formal notice to Nexora's legal team. We included a proposed licensing agreement for my intellectual property, $2.9 million for immediate retroactive licensing of all systems covered under Clause 15.3, with a 30-day temporary license to allow for negotiations without service interruption. The amount wasn't arbitrary. It represented approximately what I would have earned over the next 5 years at my current salary, the minimum time it would take them to properly replace my systems without my assistance. We received no immediate response, not that day, nor the next. Meanwhile, Elliott continued posting triumphant updates about Nexora's technical renaissance. The engineering team was apparently working around the clock to prepare for the Nexora 2.0 launch, now accelerated to just 2 weeks away. I watched from the sidelines, monitoring job boards where Nexora was suddenly posting urgently for senior security engineers and back-end architecture specialists. They were trying to fill the gaps I'd left, but expertise like mine couldn't be hired and onboarded in 2 weeks. On Thursday afternoon, 4 days after our legal notice, I finally received a response, not from Nexora's legal team, but from Marcus himself. "Jessica," the email began, with no greeting. "I've just been made aware of your legal notice. This is disappointing and unnecessary. You were compensated fairly for your work as an employee. These strong-arm tactics won't reflect well on your future employment prospects. I suggest we discuss this directly before things escalate further." I forwarded the email to David without replying. His response was swift. Classic intimidation tactic: don't engage directly. All communication should go through legal channels now. Following his advice, I didn't respond to Marcus. Instead, I focused on documenting more evidence of my contributions, organizing my code repositories, and preparing for what might become a protracted legal battle. But I also kept an eye on Nexora's public moves. Their marketing team was working overtime, teasing the upcoming platform update with promises of revolutionary security and frictionless transactions. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were marketing features built on my code, the same code they were now claiming I had no rights to. A week passed with no further communication from Nexora. The launch date for Nexora 2.0 was now just 7 days away. I began to wonder if they were simply going to ignore our legal notice and proceed as planned, gambling that I wouldn't actually pursue litigation. Then I received another LinkedIn notification. Elliot had posted again, "Final countdown to Nexora 2.0. The team has accomplished in days what would normally take months. Removing redundant security layers for performance optimization has resulted in a 300% speed improvement. Launch week is going to be epic." My blood ran cold. Removing redundant security layers? There were no redundant security layers in my system. Every protocol, every verification step, every encryption layer served a specific, necessary purpose. I took a screenshot of the post and sent it to David. "This is concerning," he replied after a few minutes. "It sounds like they're dismantling critical security components of your system." "They are," I confirmed. "And they're about to find out why those components were there in the first place." The week of the launch arrived with still no formal response to our legal notice. Nexora's marketing went into overdrive, with banner ads across financial websites and sponsored content on tech blogs. Elliot gave an interview to a startup publication, boldly claiming that Nexora 2.0 represented a complete reimagining of financial technology security. The quote that really got me came near the end of the article. "The previous architecture was built with excessive caution that actually hindered performance. We've streamlined the security protocols while maintaining enterprise-grade protection." Excessive caution, as if preventing financial fraud and data breaches were some kind of optional luxury. The launch itself came on Tuesday morning. Nexora's social media channels exploded with celebratory posts, customer testimonials, clearly prepared in advance, and flashy graphics showing the platform's new interface. Elliot posted a photo of the engineering team popping champagne, with the caption, "From vision to reality in just 3 weeks. This is what happens when you remove obstacles and empower brilliant minds." I was the obstacle, evidently. For the first few hours, everything seemed to be going according to their plan. The tech blogs published their pre-written reviews, mostly focusing on the platform's improved speed and streamlined user experience. Nexora's stock price ticked up a few points. But by mid-afternoon, the first cracks began to appear. It started with isolated reports on Twitter, users unable to log in, transactions showing as pending for hours, error messages appearing mid-transfer, the kind of glitches that might be expected with any major platform update. Except these weren't ordinary glitches. These were the predictable consequences of dismantling security protocols that had been meticulously designed to work in concert. By evening, the isolated reports had swelled into a chorus of complaints. Nexora's support Twitter account was responding to users with increasingly desperate variations of, "We're aware of the issue and working on it." I didn't feel the vindication I'd expected. Instead, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and professional indignation. This was exactly what I would have predicted, what I had tried to prevent throughout my time at Nexora. Proper security wasn't an obstacle to be removed. It was the foundation everything else depended on. The next morning brought even worse news for Nexora. Overnight, as transaction volumes decreased and their engineers presumably worked to patch the most visible issues, a more serious problem emerged. Some users reported seeing fragments of other users' financial data in their accounts. This was catastrophic for a financial platform, the digital equivalent of walking up to an ATM and seeing someone else's bank statement. Twitter and Reddit were ablaze with screenshots and panic. By noon, Nexora had taken the platform offline entirely, replacing it with a maintenance notice. "We're performing unscheduled maintenance to enhance your experience. Nexora will return shortly. We appreciate your patience." No mention of the data exposure issue, no acknowledgement of the seriousness of what was happening. I received a text from Raj. "It's a complete disaster. Elliot's blaming the junior devs. But everyone knows it's because they gutted your security protocols. Are you watching this? I'm watching, I replied, not adding that I'd anticipated something like this from the moment I read Elliot's post about removing redundant security layers. The board is getting involved, Raj continued. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow morning. That explained why. An hour later, I received an email from Nexora's legal department, the first formal response to our notice. Dear Ms. Lane, we have received your notice regarding intellectual property claims. Nexora is willing to discuss a potential licensing arrangement for certain components you contributed to during your employment. Please provide your availability for a call tomorrow to discuss terms. Regards, Nexora legal team. The tone had changed dramatically from Marcus's dismissive email just days earlier. Gone were the accusations of strong-arm tactics and veiled threats about my employment prospects. Now they were willing to discuss terms. I forwarded the email to David, who called me immediately. This is a positive development, he said, but it's also an opportunity to strengthen our position. They're clearly in crisis mode, which means we have leverage. What do you suggest? We respond cordially, but we don't rush to help them out of the mess they've created. I suggest we schedule the call for the day after tomorrow, giving their current crisis time to fully develop. That seems cold, I said, thinking of the regular users who were undoubtedly stressed about their financial data. It's business, David replied. They treated you as disposable. Now they're learning that your work wasn't. He was right, of course. Still, I couldn't help feeling conflicted. I hadn't wanted things to unfold this way. David drafted a response, scheduling the call for Thursday afternoon, deliberately after their board meeting, giving us time to see how the situation evolved. The next 24 hours were brutal for Nexora. Tech publications that had glowingly announced the platform's relaunch were now publishing articles with titles like Nexora 2.0's, a case study in failed modernization, and Security Shortcuts Lead to Data Disaster at Nexora. A financial blog called Codeline published a particularly damaging piece titled The Real Story Behind Nexora's Meltdown, which included anonymous quotes from Nexora engineers describing how critical security protocols were dismissed as redundant, and warnings from experienced team members were ignored. The article didn't mention me by name, but it wasn't hard to connect the dots, especially when it referenced the recent departure of a senior engineer who had architected much of the original platform. By Wednesday evening, Nexora's stock had dropped 22%, erasing months of gains. The platform remained offline, with the maintenance message now updated to include an apology for the extended downtime and a vague promise of enhanced security measures upon return. And then, at 9 p.m., I received a call from an unknown number. Jessica, this is Walter Grayson. Walter Grayson was Nexora's lead investor, a venture capitalist whose firm had led the Series B round that had transformed Nexora from a promising startup into a serious fintech contender. I'd met him exactly twice, at company milestones where he'd shaken my hand without really seeing me. Mr. Grayson, I said, keeping my tone neutral. This is unexpected. I imagine it is. I'm calling because I've just come out of a 6-hour emergency board meeting where your name came up repeatedly. I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. It seems we've made a series of unfortunate decisions regarding your role at Nexora and the systems you built. That's one way to put it. He cleared his throat. I'll be direct. Jessica, we need your help. The platform is in serious trouble, and the team that remains doesn't fully understand the security architecture you built. I'm aware of the situation, I said. I have a call scheduled with your legal team tomorrow to discuss licensing terms for my intellectual property. Yes, about that. His tone shifted slightly. I've reviewed your contract and the IP clause in question. Our lawyers confirm its validity, which puts us in a difficult position. Again, I remained silent, letting him fill the space. I'd like to propose an alternative arrangement outside of the formal legal channels, one that might be more beneficial for all parties involved. I'm listening. We want you back, Jessica. Not as an employee, but as a consultant with full autonomy. You would lead the effort to restore the platform's security and stability on your terms. It was the last thing I'd expected. And Elliot? Walter's sigh carried years of dealing with tech industry egos. Elliot's tenure with Nexora has been reevaluated in light of recent events. He's no longer with the company as of this evening. A weight I hadn't fully acknowledged seemed to lift from my shoulders. Not vindication, exactly, but resolution. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Grayson, but my intellectual property concerns would need to be addressed before I could consider any consulting arrangement. Of course, we're prepared to acknowledge your ownership of the specified systems and negotiate a fair licensing agreement. Additionally, your consulting rate would reflect the urgency of our current situation. I'll need to discuss this with my legal counsel before tomorrow's call. Understood. But Jessica? Yes? Time is of the essence here. Every hour the platform remains offline costs us users and market value. I'm asking you to consider not just what's best for you legally, but what solution allows the platform you built to survive. It was a subtle appeal to my pride in what I'd created, and it worked. Despite everything, I didn't want to see Nexora fail. Not just for the sake of former colleagues like Raj, but because I'd poured too much of myself into it to watch it collapse. I'll call you after I've spoken with my lawyer, I promised. That's all I can ask. Thank you, Jessica. I called David immediately after hanging up with Walter. It was late, but he picked up on the second ring. They're offering me a consulting position, I explained, to fix what Elliot broke, and they're willing to acknowledge my IP ownership. David was quiet for a moment. This could be very advantageous. If they formally acknowledge your ownership of the IP, we have leverage not just for the consulting arrangement, but for ongoing licensing fees. What would that look like? You could structure it as a perpetual license with royalty payments based on platform revenue. Given Nexora's current crisis, we're in a position to negotiate very favorable terms. I considered this. I want to help them fix the platform, but I also want protection going forward. Then let's draft a proposal that gives you both. A short-term consulting agreement at premium rates to address the immediate crisis, coupled with a long-term licensing agreement that properly values your intellectual property. We spent the next hour outlining terms. By the time we finished, I had a clear vision of what I wanted. Not just compensation for past work, but ongoing recognition of my contribution and protection against future mistreatment. The next day's call with Nexora's legal team was brief and surprisingly cordial. With Walter's intervention, they were prepared to accept most of our terms with minimal negotiation. They acknowledged my ownership of the specified systems, agreed to a 2-month consulting contract at a rate that made my eyes widen, and committed to a long-term licensing agreement with quarterly royalty payments. Most importantly, they agreed to a key stipulation. I would have veto power over any major changes to the systems I'd built. Never again would someone like Elliot be able to dismantle my work on a whim. By Friday morning, I was back at Nexora, not as an employee, but as an independent consultant with more authority than I'd ever had before. My first order of business was assessing the damage to the platform. It was worse than I'd anticipated. Elliot hadn't just removed redundant security layers. He'd fundamentally altered the architecture of the system, creating vulnerabilities that would take weeks to properly address. The data exposure issue was particularly concerning, requiring both immediate patches and a full security audit. I assembled a team of the most capable engineers still at Nexora, including Raj, who greeted me with a mix of relief and barely concealed amusement at the situation's irony. The heritage preservation lady returns to save the day, he whispered during our first planning meeting, mimicking Elliot's condescending tone. I couldn't help but smile. Let's preserve some heritage, then. We worked around the clock for the next 72 hours, implementing emergency fixes to the most critical vulnerabilities. By Monday, we had a version of the platform stable enough to bring back online, though with limited functionality while we continued repairs. Nexora issued a public statement acknowledging the security issues and outlining steps taken to address them. They didn't mention me by name, but the financial press quickly put the pieces together. with Codeline publishing a follow-up piece titled Nexora Brings Back Key Architect to Salvage, Platform After Security Crisis. The article included a statement from Walter Grayson, carefully worded to protect Nexora's reputation while tacitly acknowledging their mistake. We're fortunate to have Jessica Lane's expertise as we enhance Nexora's security infrastructure. Her understanding of financial technology security is unparalleled, and we value her ongoing contribution to our platform's integrity. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was public recognition of my value, something I'd never received during my 7 years as an employee. Over the next 2 months, I rebuilt what Elliot had broken, working with a team that now treated me with unmistakable respect. The platform gradually returned to full functionality, with enhanced security measures that addressed vulnerabilities I hadn't had the resources to tackle previously. When my consulting contract ended, I declined the offer to return as a full-time employee. Instead, I maintained my relationship with Nexora through the licensing agreement, which provided both financial security and ongoing influence over the platform's development. David helped me file an updated licensing invoice, accounting for the damage caused by the unauthorized modifications to my code, $5 million, reflecting both the direct harm to Nexora's market value and the emergency consultation required to restore functionality. After some negotiation, Nexora's board approved the payment, likely calculating that the cost of litigation, both financial and reputational, would far exceed this amount. As for Elliot, he disappeared from the tech scene for a while. His LinkedIn profile went dark, and his Twitter account, once full of entrepreneurial platitudes and tech predictions, fell silent. I heard through industry connections that he'd left the country for a sabbatical in Southeast Asia, the classic retreat for tech executives after a public failure. 6 months after the Nexora crisis, I used part of my licensing payment to put a down payment on a condo in Denver, a fresh start in a new city, with a view of the mountains I'd always loved. I set up my home office overlooking the skyline, with multiple monitors displaying code from various consulting projects I'd taken on since leaving Nexora. One screen, though, still displayed the Nexora backend, not because I was working on it that day, but because I checked it regularly, a habit born of 7 years of stewardship. The code continued to run smoothly, processing millions of transactions daily, secure and stable. My code, still mine, even as it powered a platform used by thousands. They forgot one crucial thing when they decided to fire the person who wrote the rules. Make sure she doesn't still have the original rulebook. In the end, it wasn't just about the money or the recognition, though those were certainly welcome. It was about respecting the craft, understanding that code isn't just functionality cobbled together, it's architecture meticulously designed by professionals who understand why every line matters. Elliot never understood that. Nexora learned it the hard way. And I found something I hadn't expected in the aftermath of being discarded. Not just compensation, but vindication. The system was alive. The code was mine. And somewhere in Southeast Asia, a former CTO was learning that cute code sometimes has the sharpest teeth. As I sipped my morning coffee and watched the sun rise over the Denver skyline, I couldn't help but smile at the notification that appeared on my screen. Another royalty payment from Nexora had just been deposited in my account. The company was thriving now, having recovered from the crisis and rebuilt user trust. My systems remained at its core, running smoothly and securely. I often thought about how differently things might have turned out if Elliot had approached the situation with respect rather than dismissal. If he'd seen me as a collaborator rather than an obstacle, we might have built something remarkable together, combining my security expertise with whatever vision he'd been trying to implement. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, he'd made the fatal error that so many in tech leadership make, confusing confidence with competence. My phone buzzed with a text from Raj, who'd recently been promoted to lead security engineer at Nexora. "You'll never believe who just applied for a senior position here." His message read. I didn't need to guess. Elliot? The very same. Apparently his sabbatical is over. What did Marcus say? I asked, curious how Nexora's CEO had responded. Didn't even make it to Marcus. HR flagged his application immediately. Walter's team created a new policy after the incident. Anyone involved in the platform collapse is permanently blacklisted. I felt a twinge of something, not quite sympathy, but recognition of how quickly fortunes could change in this industry. Elliot had likely thought his position unassailable, his authority absolute. Now he couldn't even get past the initial screening at the company he'd once helped lead. "He'll land somewhere," I replied, because people like Elliot always did. The tech industry had a notoriously short memory for failures. "Not anywhere that matters," Raj texted back. His name is toxic in fintech now. The Nexora meltdown case study is literally being taught in cybersecurity courses. That I hadn't known. The thought of students learning from Elliot's mistakes, and, by extension, from my work, was oddly satisfying. I set down my phone and turned back to my screens. Whicher and New Consulting's a project awaited my attention. I was selective now about the clients I took on, working only with companies that demonstrated respect for expertise and sound architectural principles. I'd learned my own lessons from the Nexora experience. The most important wasn't about contracts or legal clauses, though those had certainly saved me. It was about valuing my own work enough to defend it, about understanding that expertise earned through years of dedicated practice deserved respect. Some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I still thought about that termination Zoom call, the casual dismissal, the lack of notice, the corporate platitudes masking what was essentially theft of my intellectual contribution. The anger had faded, replaced by a calmer understanding. Elliot had never seen me clearly, had never understood what I'd built, or why. His blindness had been his downfall. My foresight and my ex-husband's legal acumen had been my salvation. As the morning light filled my Denver apartment, I watched my code run on the monitor. Still elegant, still effective, still mine. The systems processed transactions, validated credentials, protected user data, doing exactly what they were designed to do, without fanfare or flashy marketing. They forgot one thing when they fired the person who wrote the rules: make sure she doesn't still own the original rulebook.